Tonight, the Sri Lankan High Commission denied the government had carried out atrocities against the Tamil community. The Sri Lankan government launched a large-scale military offensive in January, capturing the Tamil Tiger-held town of Kilinochchi. The army then steadily pushed the rebels into a small area of the northeast. Please be warned, there are extremely disturbing scenes in this report from our Foreign Affairs correspondent, Jonathan Miller.
Sri Lanka's Sinhalese majority, the end of 26 years of war was something to celebrate. The rebel Tamil Tiger army vanquished. It had been a brutal war, upwards of 80,000 dead, soldiers and civilians, Sinhalese and Tamil, traumatized and brutalized by what they'd all been through. By January this year, government forces were closing in on a shrinking conflict zone. Unknown thousands of Tamil civilians were being killed. But independent journalists and observers were prevented from getting anywhere close. There were rumours that terrible things were happening, but this was a war without witnesses. Or at least we thought so. One soldier, we now know, had a mobile phone. And today, 8 months on, his footage has emerged. A naked man, blindfolded and bound. His last human contact, a kick in the head. It's like he jumped to soldier laughs. His Sinhalese accent, country boy. His tone, casual, like this was a game. As further gunshots ring out, the camera pans to reveal other bound bodies, 8 in total, and all but one naked. There is no indication of the ethnicity of the dead men, but the group which obtained the pictures claim the victims are Tamils. The killers are speaking Sinhala. They are wearing what appear to be Sri Lankan army uniforms. It's impossible to independently verify the authenticity of the pictures of this bloodbath. But the group of exiled Sri Lankan journalists which passed them to Channel 4 News are not a Tamil liberation group. They campaign for press freedom. Now, the existence of footage like this has been rumoured for months. It's taken 8 months for it to come out, and it was only smuggled out of Sri Lanka in the past couple of days. An independent Sri Lankan human rights investigator, a Sinhalese, who's watched the pictures with me this evening, believes them to be genuine. Towards the end of the video, a 9th man is shot dead. Extrajudicial killings by government soldiers and paramilitaries have been documented in Sri Lanka for years, but there's never been evidence like this. 280,000 Tamils remain incarcerated in camps for displaced people. The government says it needs to screen the civilian population for suspected Tamil Tiger militants. 3 months ago, Sri Lanka's victorious President Mahinda Rajapaksa promised equal rights to Tamils and said they'd be protected. If the killing field footage is authenticated, it'll do little to reassure Tamil civilians.
That report from Jonathan Miller. We asked for an interview with the Sri Lankan High Commission, but no one was available. Instead, they sent us this statement. The High Commission of Sri Lanka categorically deny that the Sri Lankan armed forces engaged in atrocities against the Sri Lankan Tamil community. They were only engaged in a military offensive against the LTTE. You can read the full statement on the Channel 4 News website.
Right, ladies and gentlemen, I don't think that's going to detain us, but let me just say good evening and welcome to everybody. I'm Stephen Sacker. I'm going to moderate this evening's discussion. I'm a journalist for the BBC. I present a show called Hard Talk on BBC World News and the News Channel. Sri Lanka is a subject dear to my heart because I've been there actually many times as a journalist, but most recently I was there for a series of special Hard Talk programmes which aired on BBC World News about 3-4 weeks ago. Some of you may have seen them. But I suppose that is one reason why I was asked to moderate. But we've got a panel of people who are going to thrash out some of the issues concerning press freedom, human rights, the rule of law, the way in which the West has reported and seen the Sri Lanka story both over the last year and going back much further than that as well, I suspect. So before we begin the discussion, I just want to introduce everybody. I'm sure everybody's still sort of slightly reeling from that because it's a difficult thing to pick up from. But let me introduce you to the panel, and then we can begin our discussion. I should start with Jonathan because you've just seen him on the screen. But Jonathan Miller is Foreign Affairs Correspondent for Channel 4 News. Jonathan, of course, heavily involved in recent controversy about the reporting of the Sri Lanka civil war and the aftermath thereof. It's not the only report Jonathan's done, of course, from Sri Lanka. He was there, I believe, in June after the war ended last year. Hasn't been there since, and we can discuss precisely why that is in some detail as well. But Jonathan is going to talk about the way Channel 4 has handled the story. Next to Jonathan is Douglas Wickramaratne. Now, Douglas is a political analyst. He's a former president of the World Federation of Sri Lankan Associations, and he is the president of the Sinhala Association of Sri Lankans in the UK. He's lived in the UK, I think, for getting on for 4 decades, Douglas, but obviously goes to and fro from Sri Lanka a great deal, still very well connected in Sri Lanka. And he's going to give us his perspective, not least on what we just saw. Over on my right, we've got Edward Mortimer, a familiar face, I'm sure, to some of you, a very experienced journalist and international sort of, well, how could I describe it? NGOer and UNer and general sort of operator and networker. Does that sound slightly sort of menacing? I hope not. Edward, at the moment, is Senior Vice President and Chief Program Officer at the Salzburg Global Seminar and Chair of the Advisory Council for the Sri Lanka Campaign for Peace and Justice. And next to Edward is Yolanda Foster, Amnesty International's Sri Lanka researcher and point woman. She knows Sri Lanka extraordinarily well, and again, it will come out in the discussion that Yolanda hasn't been able to visit Sri Lanka actually for some time, I think getting on for 18 months. And that is, I'm sure, something we need to talk about as well. So there's the panel, a lot of expertise, some different perspectives on the Sri Lanka story. There's no question, because we've just seen the film, I think we should perhaps start with Jonathan. I want everybody on the panel to give me sort of a few minutes of opening thoughts on this question. I mean, obviously we're faced with the theme tonight. It's all about human rights and about press freedom, and in particular, could the West do more when it comes to pushing the human rights and press freedom agenda in Sri Lanka? That's the sort of overarching theme tonight. We'll have a few thoughts from everybody to start with. I will then perhaps throw out a few questions to our panel, and then obviously the key to this is to get your questions and your thoughts as well to make it thoroughly interactive. So, Jonathan, why don't you kick us off with your thoughts?
Thank you, Stephen. I can go into a lot of detail about what happened before this video in our reporting at Channel 4 News and my subsequent involvement with the programme and the stories that we did on Sri Lanka. Before I do so, I've got a confession to make, which is that I'm often accused by the Sri Lankan government of having an agenda. And I want to confirm that I do have an agenda. And that agenda is shared by many journalists who have watched and followed every twist and turn of what has happened in the run-up to the end of that civil war and in the subsequent months. And that is to uncover and try to find out exactly what did happen in what has become an information black hole. Very few people know what did happen in the dying days of that conflict. Louise Arbour, a former UN Human Rights Commissioner and member of the Hague Tribunal, Chief Prosecutor of the Hague Tribunal, in London a few weeks ago, and now working for the International Crisis Group, stated that it is not implausible to suggest that 30,000 people may have died. Now, it is absolutely in the public interest, and my role as a journalist is to work to find out what happened to those people, to determine whether indeed it is true that so many people could have died, and it is in that context that we did the report that you've just seen and several others like it.
In doing so, we as a programme have come under the spotlight with the Sri Lankan government in particular. First of all, our Asia correspondent, Nick Payton-Walsh, my colleague, who'd been reporting the war, used some independently gathered material. He'd sent some cameras into the camps just after the end of the war, and for having done so, he was summarily expelled from the country with his camera crew. I went into Sri Lanka under the radar a couple of weeks later, and I discovered there a country the like of which I have not reported from before or since. I've reported from Burma, I've reported from Zimbabwe, I've reported in Darfur, and I found my experience in Sri Lanka to be deeply sinister, and I saw a repressive country, and I found it very, very difficult to work there. The killings video, which you just saw, was broadcast on the 25th of August last year. That was the day we actually received it. We did not have much time to determine its veracity or to authenticate it. We did what we could at the time to do so. We felt it was in the public interest to broadcast it, feeling that we'd done everything possible at that time to determine whether or not what we saw was for real. It came in for a barrage of propaganda protests from the Sri Lankan government, who immediately reacted by saying it was doctored, it was faked. There was a campaign to discredit the journalism. Large screeds of copy were presented on government websites attacking our program and me personally, saying that it was unprofessional and the like. All of this was quite intimidating, but nothing compared to when the Sri Lankan government then launched a series of complaints with Ofcom, the broadcasting regulator, against Channel 4 News and our programs. At the same time, they set up a commission of inquiry to look into the veracity of the video. They determined that it was a fake. Two of the members of that panel were connected with the army. The UN launched an investigation shortly after that, and three of its experts, a forensic pathologist, a forensic video analyst, and a firearms expert, all determined that they thought that the video was, to the best of their ability to determine, authentic, and that it appeared genuine. And Philip Alston, the UN Special Rapporteur, then said that there should be an independent, impartial war crimes inquiry. On the eve of the release of that report, the Sri Lankan government withdrew all its Ofcom reports against Channel 4 News. Now, we have been forced, through circumstance, to report second-hand from Sri Lanka. We send journalists in under the radar, undercover, to bring reports back to us. And where possible, we have sought to determine the, to authenticate the material which they bring back. And on the whole, we trust this material would never broadcast it if we didn't. I've got to say just another quick caveat to all of this, which is, as foreign journalists reporting the situation in Sri Lanka, we're privileged because we do not suffer the intimidation that journalists in Sri Lanka do. Can I just tell you that in the last year, in the last 3 years, 15 journalists have been killed in Sri Lanka. In the last year, 29 journalists have been forced to flee the country. Others have been abducted and beaten. Some have just disappeared. There's a journalist, a political cartoonist for Sri Lanka E-News, who was abducted 119 days ago today, and there's still no mention of where he is. Others have been murdered, including Lasanta Wickramaratne, who was the editor of the Sunday Tribune. In that climate, it's very difficult to expect Sri Lankan journalists to be able to operate independently. And the truth of the matter is that it has become increasingly difficult for them, or for foreigners, to be quite honest, to present an accurate portrayal of what is happening in that country and what happened in the run-up to the end of the war. People have been silenced. Very few are left now who dare to raise their heads above the parapet, because to do so would be to be branded a traitor. Thank you.
Good. No, thank you very much, Jonathan. Let's just continue round the panel and get opening remarks. So Douglas, if you would, give us your opening thoughts.
Yes, thank you, Stephen. What I say is quite, I'm going to contradict what Jonathan Miller has been talking about. Let me begin by saying Sri Lanka is not some tin pot dictatorship. It is a democracy, and we are one of the oldest democracies in Asia. we have regular elections. We have more elections than here where people get a choice to vote, presidential election, the general elections, the provincial council elections, the municipal elections, the local election, even village level elections. That goes on all throughout the year. And when I mean, I don't want to concentrate on this particular film that was being shown, that have been disputed. Just, it is very easy for, nowadays, I mean, I was reading only last week that the American CIA considered at one time making a fake film of Saddam Hussein about his sexual escapades to discredit him and putting doubles of Saddam Hussein. And they considered that seriously and they gave up the idea. But whether, I mean, a film, so I will not go on to talk about the film which had been disputed by the government of Sri Lanka. What I want to say is that when you talk about freedom of the press in Sri Lanka, there are in Sri Lanka, actually, there are 31 TV channels and 60 radio channels, 35 newspapers, and there are about nearly over 250,000 internet users. Now, all these newspapers are not government newspapers. I can show you these Sunday newspapers here. These are highly critical of the government. They're independent newspapers. I know you have freedom of the press in this country in certain other ways. You think there are a few press barons own the press here, and that you consider as freedom of the press. But in Sri Lanka, we don't have press barons. In fact, some of these papers are owned by opposition candidates, their relations, and most of those papers are highly critical of the government. And so there is, when you say that there are journalists disappearing from Sri Lanka, and the journalists have supplied this kind of film. I was only in Brussels just 2 weeks ago, and I came across a Sri Lankan journalist there who says in his speech, he said he had escaped from Sri Lanka, that he's not allowed to come back to Sri Lanka. I challenged the man. I can name him. Sunanda Desapriya. I asked him, the Sri Lankan government hasn't stopped you. You have run away with NGO funds. The NGO of Sarana Mupaki Sote Sarana Muttu himself had made the comment that this man has run away with our funds and we are waiting to charge him when he comes to Sri Lanka. So these journalists are very good at spreading stories that if they want to escape to the West with funds, they will come out and say, well, we can't work in Sri Lanka. Now, you mentioned about a journalist that disappeared. I mean, that journalist disappeared about a couple of years ago, and he suddenly turned up, and he never explained where he had been. I mean, journalists are not some super angel. They also have their own private grudges, their own mistresses, their problems with their wives. They run away, and then everything in Sri Lanka is blamed on the government of Sri Lanka. I mean, the fact is now recently there have been some serial killer killing beggars in Sri Lanka. And one paper suggested that it is the Sri Lankan STF that is doing the killing. And then the next thing is, yes, there are meetings being held over here. It must be the government that is doing the killing of the beggars. I mean, everything that goes on in Sri Lanka, which is negative, is reported in this hostile press in Sri Lanka, in terms that would not be approved in a country like this at all. But let me say that actually one of the charges, the whole episode of this 30-year war, we have just come out of a most vicious 30-year war where our people were not safe on the streets of Sri Lanka at any time, where mothers and fathers couldn't take their children to school. They had to travel in separate buses in case husband and wife are blown up. And I have personally lost my relatives and my dear friends to suicide bombers. So we have all experienced the most vicious kind of terrorism in Sri Lanka. You have not experienced this kind of thing anywhere. You had 60 people died in a suicide bomb attack in London, and you passed emergency laws quickly, and of course there was shoot to kill policy even. I mean, if it was Sri Lanka, if what was happening in Sri Lanka happened on the streets of London, then you would be shocked how the government would react to that kind of thing. Now, let me very briefly say what are the reasons behind this terrorism in Sri Lanka. Now, we have had over 150 years of British rule, and everybody knows during that time we had the famous divide and rule policy. They brought 1 million Indians from India, Tamils from India, and we didn't act like the East African countries, just deporting them overnight. We assimilated the India. Give us credit. Sri Lanka is a democracy where even in these countries, when you had token women politicians, we are the first country in the world that produced the first woman prime minister of the world. And we also had a woman president and a woman prime minister at the same time. We are the only country in the world that have done this kind of thing. And give us some credit. We defeated a terrorist movement when everybody was saying that they cannot be defeated. And because the West had covertly supported terrorism. And do you know that when they first started the movement in 1976, the famous Wickramaratne resolution, the preamble to the resolution says it has always been a matter of despair for the Tamils that they live whether they live in India, Sri Lanka, Malaysia, Thailand, it goes on to all the countries, that we do not have a homeland. So we decided to set up a homeland in Sri Lanka for the 100 million Tamils, and it says here later on, any Tamilian living anywhere in the world of that 100 million can be citizens of Tamil Elam in Sri Lanka. That is how the Wickramaratne resolution, which
Douglas, context is very important, but can I encourage you perhaps to draw to a close just with opening remarks soon, because we do want to get some opening remarks from everybody. Is there any other single point you want to make, or are you happy to stick there? And
I'll just make two quick points. When the, terrorism happens in this country, they give it different names. Like now, when you kidnap people from countries and take them away, they say, no, we don't kidnap terrorists. That is called rendition. So it is not kidnapping. We don't torture. We don't do torturing. But it's just waterboarding only we did. I'm talking about the West, what they said. We don't do torture, they said. No, it's only waterboarding. That is not torture. And then when they kill civilians, thousands of civilians, they say, oh, it's collateral damage. So everybody except the press says, oh, yes, collateral damage.
Great. Douglas, thank you very much. You made so many points there. We're going to struggle to encompass them all in the next hour of debate. But before we get to the debate, Yolanda, why don't you give us your opening thoughts next?
I mean, the reality is that in Sri Lanka there is a climate of fear for journalists, and the reality is that we don't actually know what is happening in terms of human rights abuses, because there are restrictions on the media, there are restrictions on human rights agencies who would like to visit the country. And I thought that rather engaging in counterclaims and things like that, that I just wanted to share this evening the story of one journalist who tried to tell the truth. His story is not as well known as others, but I think it highlights how a climate of fear means that there's a veil of secrecy covering up human rights abuses. And I wanted to mention the case of Subramaniam Sudirajan. He was a Trincomalee port employee and journalist. He was living and working in Trincomalee, which is a city on the east coast of Sri Lanka, in 2006. He reported on a very particular case which later on became famous, which was the case of 5 young students who gathered on the 2nd of January at the seaside at around 7 p.m. and they were caught up in the fact that Trinco town had been coming under quite high security in the preceding weeks. The students were on quite a quiet road, but it was quite a high security zone, and a 3-wheeler allegedly passed close by to them and a grenade was thrown out. There was a team of security officers who were at the scene. They were allegedly members of the special task force. They were uniformed. They then took these 5 young students, beat them about the head with rifle butts, and then, according to an eyewitness account, shot them dead in the back of the head. Now, instead of securing the zone, calling in the police, having a proper investigation, the bodies were covered, hidden. They were taken to the Trincomalee hospital, and the public was not allowed to look at the bodies. This one journalist, who was a photographer, managed to get to the hospital. He visited the mortuary, and he took photographs demonstrating clearly that the students had gunshot injuries in the back of the head. His photographs, which were then leaked to the Tamil media, covered in Sudaoli, which is a known paper in the East Coast, provided the counter evidence to the government's official statement that these young students had been killed prematurely in this grenade attack. A few days later, on the 24th of January, this journalist was himself shot dead, gunned down by unidentified persons travelling on a motorbike. That is the reality of what it means to be a journalist in Sri Lanka today, if you have a critical voice, if you want to tell the truth. Others have mentioned at least 15 journalists have been killed in Sri Lanka in the last 3 years. And the reality is there has been not a single successful independent investigation into any of these cases of killings. Amnesty has raised these questions with the UN Special Procedures. We've asked the government if they're sincere about media freedom, why don't they invite the Special Rapporteur on freedom of expression to visit the country? Why don't they allow human rights groups such as Amnesty to come in and make an independent assessment? But the reality is they want to cover up what is happening, so there are restrictions. We saw this very clearly during the conflict when the combat zone was completely sealed off. And actually the government was issuing very estimates of the civilians who were trapped in the zone, which were gross underestimates. I mean, I can list a number of official reports in January, February and March in 2009 when the government claimed there were less than 100,000 civilians in the zone. Then miraculously, when the war was coming to an end and the government wanted to launch what it called a hostage-taking operation, the figures suddenly shot up to what the UN and groups like Amnesty and other human rights groups had been saying, which was that there were almost 250,000 civilians trapped inside the zone. So the reality is there is a climate of fear in Sri Lanka. And if there isn't, why doesn't the government let human rights groups in?
Yolanda, thank you very much. And to finish off our round from the panel, Edward.
Thank you very much. I'm the odd person out on this panel because I have actually never been to Sri Lanka, and I make no claim to be an expert or a specialist in Sri Lankan affairs. I was approached somewhat over a year ago and asked to take an interest. And the reason I think for this was that I have been, as Stephen said, a journalist and for a time an official of the United Nations. And of course, you know, one gets a lot of requests, and many things are wrong in the world, and you never know. You know, one would like to take up all of them. Why did I take up this one? Because in 1994, when I was a journalist on the Financial Times, I'd been writing columns on foreign affairs, and I became aware that, you know, something nasty was going on in Rwanda, and I wrote a sort of slightly flip column about that, saying, you know, maybe this deserves a little bit more attention than it's getting. I subsequently joined the UN. I worked with Kofi Annan, who had been the head of the peacekeeping department at the time of the genocide in Rwanda, and also at the time of the massacre in Srebrenica, which has since been determined to be genocide by the International Tribunal. And there's no doubt that Kofi Annan was marked by that experience and was determined that the United Nations should not again be in the position of standing by with its own forces on the spot and allowing such things to happen. So I felt, when I heard about what was happening in Sri Lanka, this time I'm not going to wait and be told or have to say a few years later how terrible, if only we had known better what was happening. I felt that I should interest myself now, while it might not be too late to do something. I don't think I've been able to do very much, but I have agreed to be the chair of, as you heard, of the advisory council of this campaign for peace and justice in Sri Lanka, which is not, although you probably will hear that alleged, a front for the Tamil Tigers or any such body. It's simply seeking to try and apply the same degree of attention from the world media and the international system to what appears to have happened and be happening in Sri Lanka that we would expect, where there are, you've heard some of the numbers, that the International Crisis Group believes that at least 30,000 civilians were killed in the last stages of the war last year? Well, a maximum of 1,500 civilians were killed in the Israeli operation in Gaza in January of last year, according to the Goldstone report. And that, rightly, has been the subject of widespread international outrage. A commission of inquiry appointed by the Human Rights Council and led by very distinguished international jurist, Justice Richard Goldstone. Justice Goldstone actually gave an interview last week to an Austrian newspaper because he was visiting Austria, and he said that he was very disappointed by the performance of the Human Rights Council. He hoped that this inquiry that he had done, and which he had insisted on doing on an even-handed basis, looking into alleged violations by both sides in the conflict, would be the start of a new chapter in the Council's history. But that he felt this had not been the case, and he was particularly disappointed by their failure to investigate properly what had happened in Sri Lanka. So I am concerned about that. I am very concerned about the fate of journalists in Sri Lanka. I think the name has already been mentioned of Lasantha Wickramaratne. And I think perhaps most people might be familiar, but I think it bears repeating what he wrote in January of last year. And I should say that this meeting was originally planned in January of 2010 to mark the first anniversary of the death of Lasantha Wickramaratne. And it was only because of the very inclement weather, which you might remember we had in January, that it had to be postponed. And I'm very glad that we are having it now. Of course, it's now 18 months after his death. He was the founder of the Sri Lankan newspaper, The Sunday Leader. And I expect some of you remember what he wrote. The free media serve as a mirror in which the public can see itself sans mascara and styling gel. He was a great writer. From us, you learn the state of your nation, and especially its management by the people you elected, democracy, to give your children a better future. Sometimes the image you see in that mirror is not a pleasant one. But while you may grumble in the privacy of your armchair, the journalists who hold the mirror up to you do so publicly and at great risk to themselves. That is our calling, and we do not shirk it. No other profession calls on its practitioners to lay down their lives for their art, save the armed forces, and, in Sri Lanka, journalism. People often ask me why I take such risks and tell me it is a matter of time before I am bumped off. Of course, I know that. It is inevitable. But if we do not speak out now, there will be no one left to speak for those who cannot. That editorial was published only after his death, and he was assassinated in broad daylight. No one has been arrested or prosecuted for his murder, and that is only one of a number of cases. I think that's enough in the way of a second-hand account from me, but we have a first-hand account from a journalist who recently visited Sri Lanka and who wants to go back there and therefore doesn't want to read it personally to you this evening. But a member of the club, Carolyn Heyman, has very kindly agreed to read it.
I'll read it.
Oh, I thought you had it, sorry. Has anybody got a copy of it?
This is a Sri Lankan or
a European journalist who recently returned. And I'm so sorry because I was sent it by email and I didn't have a printer, and I understood that you would have it.
I'll see if I can find it.
All right, maybe we should carry on.
We can come back to that.
Yes,
we can come back to that, don't worry. Look, thanks panel for opening thoughts. There's an awful lot to chew on there. Some of it very specific to the issues concerning press freedom. Some much wider points about what has happened in Sri Lanka over the last year and a half, but more particularly, I suppose, in terms of Douglas's presentation over many years preceding in terms of the context. In a way, the panel is odd because Douglas clearly is the only man up here, the only person up here who sort of speaks from the point of view of defending the record of the Sri Lankan government. So there's a great temptation for me as the chairman of the panel and the moderator to begin quizzing Douglas at some length. I am going to put a couple of questions to Douglas, but I'm going to actually, I've got several questions I want to put to the other members of the panel. So do not please think that I'm about to sort of engage in a hard talk with Douglas, because that's not what this is about at all. But Douglas, I am going to start with you, and then I'm going to move to the others. It seems to me that there is, amongst the other three on the panel, one basic feeling and clear voice, and that is that it is vitally important to know as best one can the truth of what happened, particularly during the last months of the war in the north. Would you accept that it is vitally important for the good of Sri Lanka and for international notions of justice to know what happened and to have an independent verdict on what happened?
Well, you see, it is important, all right. I mean, if you look at England, the bloody Sunday thing happened in 1974. It took you over 25 years to have an investigation. Here we have just come out of a most ruthless terrorist war that any nation could ever face. And we have come out of it, and we are trying to get on with the post-war period. And then it is not the time for others to intervene, the so-called international community at this moment, to disrupt what is going on in Sri Lanka now. There's peace in Sri Lanka. I've just arrived from Sri Lanka. The Tamils, mainly the Tamils who live in Colombo area, I have met quite a few of them. They're saying, we are so glad the LTT have been wiped out. We are able to go back to our homes in the north, see the homes that have been occupied by other people, and the Muslims who had been thrown out of the northern area. And the NGOs never mentioned a word about they had been there for nearly 20 years. And they were driven, ethnic cleansing was introduced. So those people are going back now. This is not the time to disrupt that harmony.
I'm struggling to understand why it would be so disruptive and so damaging, for example, to accede to the UN Secretary General and Security Council's request to have an internationally appointed panel of experts to come into Sri Lanka, look at the evidence, visit some of the key sites, talk to witnesses, and as best they can get to the bottom of what happened. Why would that be so damaging to Sri Lanka?
We are a sovereign state, and no sovereign state would allow that kind of interference by an international organization. Why are we just picking on Sri Lanka? Because it's easy to pick on bully a small island? Why not about the killings in Iraq, in Afghanistan? Would anybody investigate America or the Britain's part in those things? No, they pick on a small country, and they try to browbeat that country to say that, yeah, you agree to what we want. We have appointed our own committee. We are quite capable of investigating, and that is why the President has appointed a committee now. Let the committee do its work. Why should others interfere in that work? That is of very eminent people. That committee is composed of very eminent people. They're quite capable of making a judgment, making investigation.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just interested for you as a representative of the Sinhalese population in the UK, and obviously a man who cares deeply about Sri Lanka's standing and reputation in the world, and you've used the word democracy and you've used words like freedom many times. Can you see personally that it might help Sri Lanka's standing in the world? And Edward's talked about what happened in Rwanda, and we've heard reference to the international tribunal that's looked at what happened in the former Yugoslavia. And we know, at least I think most of us accept, that many thousands of civilians died in northern Sri Lanka in that last brutal phase of the war. Do you not accept that it might be helpful to Sri Lanka in the long run to have an international element to any investigation?
No, right now what I said is, as a democracy, we are quite capable of looking into the problem, and you have seen on the screen how people were escaping from the clutches of the LTTE. Hundreds of thousands of them escaping, and they were shot at by the LTTE. And I mean, as BBC and Channel 4 are here, I can say that the Channel 4 over the years had carried on a vicious campaign against Sri Lanka. They, in fact, some years ago, they had a film called Suicide Warriors, showing the young girl suicide killers as suicide warriors. They depict, and I challenged them on the Right to Reply program. And then the BBC, which has a Sinhalese program called Sandesaya, was run by the LTT man in London. And can you imagine at the height of the IRA problem?
Can you say that name, please?
Vasanta Raja.
Vasanta Raja is LTT?
Yeah.
Oh, I see. He's a mixed Sinhalese, no?
But he's an LTT agent. I'm not talking about his.
Well, you know, we can't just go throwing around accusations and allegations
Vasanta
like this.
Raja. I can. Vasanta Raja and I had a 4-hour debate on radio, where somebody challenged how did Vasanta Raja come on that, and the moderator, Dr. Litt, said we asked the LTT office in London to nominate.
Well, Douglas, I doubt very much that he presented you with his card saying I am a member of the LTT.
No, he was nominated by the LTT.
Well, you know, I think we're slightly. First of all, we're raising allegations that there is no way of proving or disproving in this forum, and second of all, it really, frankly, isn't the point to go too deep into individuals and their affiliations. And I've tried to tease out a point with you there, and let me just move on, because you've just shifted this onto the question of whether you can trust the independence of the international media and the way it reports Sri Lanka. So let's switch to Jonathan for a moment. One thing that struck me about the report, Jonathan, and it's only one of the reports Channel 4 aired, but there was very little context in that report. You did make some opening remarks about the scale of the damage done in the war to both sides, the fact that it had been very harmful to both sides, both Tamil and Sinhalese. But in the war itself, and in the final phase of the war, there were important human rights allegations aimed directly at the Tamil Tigers. And I have actually, because of the visa situation more recently than you, been in the north of Sri Lanka, and I was able to travel relatively freely, and we can talk about your vision of the sinister nature of the Sri Lankan state in a minute, but I was able to travel relatively freely, and I did hear from quite a lot of Tamils who said, as Douglas just characterized it, that, my God, you know, thanks to God that the LTT are away from my area. They recruited my children. They forced us to travel with them as they retreated back to that final sliver of territory, and they would not let us leave. And people did tell me that, and there's no way they were being oppressed at the time. They were not being forced to tell me that. It was an opinion I heard from some Tamils. Was that not an important thing to put into reports at the same time as portraying the powerful evidence of atrocities by the Sri Lankan armed forces?
Very much so, and we have consistently and repeatedly done so. I watched your report. It was a very good report. It was actually. It's well worth watching on the web, and it's, you know, it was quite clear from the testimony which you received that there are former guerrillas and those who lived in abject fear of the Tigers. They were a truly brutal organisation. They used child soldiers. They used indiscriminate suicide bombing of civilians. There is no doubt about that. And I've taken great pains to point that out in every single piece that I have done to try to be balanced. However, that particular piece that you watched there, that report, was very much focusing on that one incident and that particular video which we had received. But even within that report, there was context saying that this brutal 30-year civil war had finished and that both sides had suffered terribly under it. If I may, I can just go back to address something that Douglas said there about you're picking on us. The media in general in this country, you accused well, you inferred that we do not investigate problems of human rights abuse or excesses of the military, our own military, or the American military in Afghanistan and Iraq, the excesses of the Israeli military in Palestine. Of course we do. That's what we do as journalists. We try to find out what these governments have done often it is difficult to do so. And there is no place that I have ever worked where it has been more difficult to do so than in Sri Lanka. This is a country in which the no-fire zone was completely closed to journalists. Later, the camps in which all those tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands at one point were incarcerated and interned, they were closed to journalists. And not only were they closed to journalists, they were closed to human rights workers, they were closed to aid workers, they were closed to the ICRC, which has not even had access to the 10,000 former combatants who remain in those camps to this day. That, in my mind, is tantamount to what goes on in places like North Korea and in Burma. It's the very worst. And that's what I don't understand. If you want to allow the world to judge you and to be transparent, let journalists in. Why don't you let more people in? Stephen was able to go. Why don't you let us in? Oh, sorry, I'm referring to you as though you're a member of the government, and I do understand. I do apologise.
Yeah, we have to be careful about that, but Douglas, feel free to explain why, in your opinion, the government, of which you're not a part, but why the government doesn't. And you know, just to explain to everybody, we pushed hard for a very long time to get access to Sri Lanka, and the truth is we were given relatively a large amount of freedom to travel around the north, but we were not able to go to the final northeastern sliver of territory where the war, the end game in the war played itself out. We couldn't go there, but we were able to travel freely in Kilinochchi and Jaffna and other parts of the north, which was unusual. I think we're the only international TV crew who's been able to do that in the last year or so. But the point is, visas are still very difficult to get. Channel 4 haven't had visas for a long time. BBC struggles to get visas. We were the only crew to get visas on the basis of relatively free access for an awful long time at the BBC. So there's the question, why?
There are actually 45 agencies right now in the north, including 16 INGOs and 29 local NGOs. BBC is not the only people that are allowed. Al Jazeera has gone there. There have been other agencies that have been allowed to come in. But as I said before, we are just coming out of this vicious war. It is not the time for people to go and be investigating what happened there. It is the future that is more important for us. And we want a future free of terrorism in Sri Lanka. And the only way that we can do that is not by digging. Now, when you say the people said 40,000 or 30,000 died, the original figure was 1,000 died. Then people didn't take any interest. Then they added another, they said, no, 10,000 died. And then it went on from, the Times said, no, it should 30,000. Then another person says, no, it's 40,000. So these stories are, every time that some story comes, it's not for a government to be saying, oh yes, you come and investigate us and see whether it is true or not. We are a sovereign country. We are quite capable of managing our affairs. We can make our own thing. And our people know it. That is why the people, Tamil people in the north, not the Tamil diaspora who lives in abroad, the Tamil people who live in the country, are for the first time are free to vote, take part in elections. That is what we want, the future, future away from terrorism. And that is what not only the majority, the Tamils also want that.
Well, it is a point that one hears time and again in Colombo, that this is a very damaged society. It has just emerged from 30 years of war, and that actually it is much more important to work on reconstruction, rehabilitation of communities, everything from demining to infrastructure development. They are, and I've seen it myself, building new roads into the north. There's a big plan for a railway network which will reach Jaffna. You know, that sort of delivery of infrastructure and better economic circumstance to the people of the north is much more important than dredging over how the LTTE was finally defeated.
I think what's important to remember is that, you know, apart from the most recent conflict, Sri Lanka has been trapped in a cycle of impunity for over 3 decades. And today, there are no enforceable justice mechanisms for victims' families in Sri Lanka. I would challenge Douglas that there exist, you know, good mechanisms inside Sri Lanka. Last year, Amnesty launched a report called 20 Years of Make-Believe, where we analysed a series of ad hoc commissions of inquiry that the government had set up to investigate human rights abuses. The reality is that there is no good witness protection in Sri Lanka. Witnesses have been intimidated and killed. And in fact, the government has ignored sometimes the very good recommendations of commissioners themselves. If Sri Lanka is going to turn a page on this impunity, it needs to break the cycle and it needs to deliver truth, justice to victims' families. I've interviewed a number of war survivors since the end of the conflict, including children. I've spoken to young girls who are actually mute because of the months of seeing bodies lying around them, shells raining down on them, people having to, you know, just dispose of their loved one's body, not able even to give a ceremony to that. And some of these children, for example, have drawn pictures of what, you know, life was like for them in the no-fire zone. It was horrific. They deserve to know what happened. And it's very true that we need to hold the LTT to account. Amnesty has written many reports over the decades criticising the LTT. In fact, the LTT have also been complicit in restricting media freedom in Sri Lanka. They, you know, surveyed journalists who came into areas under their control. They assassinated, you know, people who had critical voices. It's absolutely vital, though, that Sri Lanka does turn a page and begins to start to address the reality of human rights in the country.
One element we haven't talked about, and our theme tonight, or our defining question is, could the West do more about human rights and press freedom? I want to come back to press freedom because that, after we're in the Frontline Club, and it is hugely important for us all. But just thinking about the West generally and governance, Edward, this perhaps comes to you because of your UN background. The EU, for example, has, without using the word sanctions, imposed some punishments on Sri Lanka for its human rights record, which include ending favoured nation trading status in textiles, for example, which could damage the Sri Lankan textile industry to a point where they say tens of thousands of jobs could be lost. Now, do you think that sort of Western pressure on post-war Sri Lanka is the right thing to do in response to some of the things we've heard tonight?
I actually think that what you said doesn't correspond to what has happened. This was not most favoured nation status, which is the...
Well, it's a complicated, it's GSP plus or something.
Yes,
but
plus, and the plus is important. First of all, GSP is already better than most favoured nation status. That's something which is given to all developing countries. GSP plus is a very special regime indeed, which has only been given to 15 countries, and only Sri Lanka is the only country in Asia to which it was given. It was given as a special concession after the tsunami, and it was very clearly spelled out at the time that this was on the understanding that Sri Lanka would ratify and implement a whole range of international obligations, some of which relate to human rights and democracy.
Yes, so my point remains that taking it back, ending it, has been sent as a signal to Colombo saying you are not doing what we need you to do on a raft of human rights issues.
Well, I think that Colombo simply has not fulfilled the conditions on which this concession was given.
And if that damages the Sri Lankan economy, and some independent experts believe that it could be extremely damaging to one of Sri Lanka's most important revenue earners, that is the textile industry, is that a stick that is still worth using?
I think it's a question you should ask to President Rajapaksa. I don't know maybe whether Douglas would have a view on it. Yeah. But the fact is that Sri Lankan industry and Sri Lankan workers have benefited from a very privileged condition on a particular understanding, to the disadvantage, I might say, of workers in Bangladesh and many other Asian countries. And I don't think the European Union would have been able to defend itself in front of the World Trade Organization if it had continued this very special concession when the other party had flagrantly, according to a very careful investigation, failed to fulfill the conditions on which it was accepted. And now, even when the Commission said, well, if you can convince us that you are making a real effort now to implement these things, maybe we could extend it for another 6 months. And instead of coming and trying to convince them, President Rajapaksa basically told them to get lost, said, we don't need it, we'll manage very well without it, thank you very much.
No, that's not what happened. I was in Sri Lanka recently. It's amazing. There were about 200 women, child soldiers, now the grown-up girls, who are now being rehabilitated, working in these factories. They're being given jobs. Now, the next thing is, well, they will be...
We'll get to the audience in a sec, hang on.
The jobs are given to them to rehabilitate, right? Now, as far as the GSP Plus, that was introduced, as you rightly said, after the tsunami, but the height of a war that was going on. And our delegation to Brussels had repeatedly shown that since the 2nd of May, the government had decided to withdraw a substantial segment of the emergency regulations, because we don't have an emergency now, where not like what it was. But the thing is to put such conditions on a country, and then to punish a country, because the idea is to destabilize Sri Lanka. Some of the Western countries want to defeat Rajapaksa by hook or crook, to get rid of him. That is the whole idea. They want to bring the economy down. That will not
do you
happen.
really believe that?
Yes,
that there is an agenda in important Western capitals that is specifically designed to bring Rajapaksa and arguably the rest of his family down. That is what they want.
In fact, they supported Sarath Fonseca, repeating his story about during the election time. We have found that there's huge amounts of money, millions of dollars have been sent to Sri Lanka from foreign countries. And that money, some of it have been caught now, and Sarath Fonseca is being charged for that as well. And Sarath Fonseca, for all the free media people, Amnesty International, Sarath Fonseca issued a statement only the other day, over the weekend, saying that the army never carried out any of these atrocities that are being accused. No newspaper
Could you tell us where he issued that statement from?
He had given us interview to the newspaper called Lakbima.
Where was he at the time?
In Colombo.
Whereabouts in Colombo?
In Parliament.
He's in detention, isn't he?
No, but in Parliament.
Yeah, but he only goes to Parliament under special police escort from his military detention.
Because there are charges against him.
I mean, that's right. But the point even that, you know, without going into too much detail about Sarath Fonseca, but I'm probably the one member of this panel who's actually spoken to the man relatively recently.
Yeah.
I mean, the point about Fonseca is that he is saying now, under very heavy pressure, that the army never fulfilled the orders which he has eyewitness evidence suggesting they were given by the Defence Secretary. He's not saying the Defence Secretary never gave the order to shoot to kill in those final hours of the war when the final Tamil Tiger remnants, including some senior leaders, were emerging from their final redoubt. He's not saying that order was not given. He's simply saying the army didn't do it. Now, there are various reasons why he might be saying that, but he's certainly not saying, he's not retracting the what he has.
Shall I read out what the particular party said? He said, as commander of the army who led the war, we waged war while adhering to the rules of engagement. Our security forces fought in compliance with the international convention and humanitarian law.
Exactly.
That is what he said on Sunday.
Makes no mention there of the Defence Secretary whatsoever. His original allegation was that an eyewitness heard the Defence Secretary issue an order to shoot to kill them all as people were surrendering at the end of the war.
No,
that was an order that he says an eyewitness heard Gotabaya Rajapaksa gave to his field commander. He never said the field commander carried it out. He said that was the order that came from the Defence Secretary.
But later he withdrew that to say he heard it from X, who had said that to Y, and then he heard it from his X.
I tell you what the story is. The story is that there was an embedded, pooled Sri Lankan journalist who overheard the conversation that was taking place between Rajapaksa and the field commander. That journalist, I happen to know, is now in hiding in another country because he does not feel that he would be able to survive currently in Sri Lanka. That journalist is not in Sri Lanka. As Jonathan said, there are many journalists who've had to leave Sri Lanka.
You see,
and I want to come back to this point, and then I'm going to open it up, because, you know, we've talked a little bit about context, we've talked about Western governments, but we are primarily here to think about press freedom. And one thing you suggested, and you brought in the aid of a few papers, is you said There are dozens of newspapers in Sri Lanka that operate independently, that can be as critical as they like, and indeed TV stations as well. But I know the Sri Lankan press pretty well. Most of these newspapers are not free to report just as they would wish. There are incredible controls in Sri Lanka on the media. Yes, they have the right to air opinions that criticise the government, no question about that. Most of them choose not to, but some of them do. But when it comes down to actual investigative journalism, challenging journalism, alleging corruption, alleging wrongdoing, if you write that sort of piece in a Sri Lankan newspaper, still more difficult on Sri Lankan television, you face trouble. And that's the truth.
If you read the Sunday Leader newspaper every Sunday, there's
I do read it a
investigative
lot.
journalism, and they attack the country, they attack ministries, they attack corruption.
But as you know, I just spoke to the editor of the Sunday Leader, the woman who took over from Mr. Wickramaratne. Frederica Jans says that she now, and I'm using a word she used to me, self-censors. She says she tries to follow Wickramaratne's adage to be unbowed and unafraid. But she said the fact is, in today's Sri Lanka, she has to exercise an element of self-censorship. I went to the TV station MTV, which is perhaps the most independent, perhaps the only TV station that tries to run an independent news service on television in Sri Lanka. Their transmitter, as you know better than me, Douglas, their transmitter was attacked by a mob not so very long ago, was burnt to the ground.
Daylight, they attacked them.
Sorry?
Daylight, they attacked the MTV station.
They lied.
In mid-afternoon, he said daylight.
Sorry?
It's in daylight.
Oh, in daylight, yeah. I mean, there was no secret about it, that's for sure. I mean, the place was up in flames. You know, and this is the reality, and I spoke to one of the editors of MTV who only a few weeks previous had had a bunch of thugs follow him home and had beaten him up very close to his own house. This is the reality. I mean, you can deny it, or you can tell me that
Shall I tell you
one
something,
story that I
Stephen?
heard.
Shall I tell you something, Stephen? In London, in Harrow, the Tamil Broadcasting Corporation, that was a radio broadcast that was against the Tamils, a Tamil group, that was assaulted. Those people were assaulted 3 times. This is in London.
But that's not really helpful in discussing whether there's press freedom in Sri Lanka.
When you make allegations against Sri Lanka, saying that this is connected with Sri Lanka, because it was the LTT agents who did that, and the police had not taken any action till about, they were forced to almost at the 4th or 5th time. But in Sri Lanka, one thing about this press matter is this: in the north, when the problems were there were, when the LTT was ruling that area, there were also other Tamil parties, and who carried up weapons as well. The government had no control over them, and they were killing each other as well. And there were journalists killed by those people. So everything is not, I mean, it is not normal circumstances. Now, even the foreign officer issued a statement to say that things have calmed down quite a lot. There are no disappearances now in Sri Lanka.
That's not true.
There's no disappearance of journalists in Sri Lanka.
What about Pragitha Kaviragoda?
has reported that there are kidnappings and disappearances only last month.
If somebody disappeared, I mean...
All right, I'll tell you what. Wait, Yolanda, have a final word from the panel, and then I'm going to open it up to questions from the floor.
I mean, the reality is that Sri Lanka itself wanted to be a member of the international community, and it made a promise. It asked to join the Human Rights Council in 2006. It promised to adhere to a number of international treaties, and in fact, one of the covenants that GSP Plus was measured against, the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, is something that Sri Lanka chose to sign up to. But the reality is it's simply not adhering to that, and a very clear example of that is the continued use of the Prevention of Terrorism Act in Sri Lanka. That violates Article 14 of the Covenant. That's a reason why the security forces have sweeping power, why they can detain people, not produce them before a magistrate before 3 days. I mean, it just intimidates, and that's a reason why media professionals feel scared.
I've just remembered one more point I wanted to make, which is not directly aimed at Douglas, because there is a danger that we all sort of pile in on Douglas.